And just to begin, I want to say Anin, Bojo, Ojibway, Kwe, Nidishnaka, Sandabena Donjiba, Makwado Dem. I would like to begin by paying my respects to the elders past, present, and future, for they hold the knowledge, teachings, traditions, and future hopes of my people. My English name is Holly Prince, and I'm an Anishinaabe Kwe, a member of Opawaganising in Northwestern Ontario. I am the lead for the Indigenous Peoples Health and Aging Division here at the Center for Education and Research on Aging and Health at Lakehead University, where I work as a project manager developing, implementing, and evaluating Indigenous health equity initiatives. I want to recognize that the land that I'm on today is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, and both Fort William First Nation, where the current city of Thunder Bay is located, as well as Opawaganising, my community, which is about an hour northeast of Fort William First Nation, are both signatories to the Robson-Superior Treaty of 1850. And while we meet on this virtual platform, I want to acknowledge that this discussion and the work that we're going to be doing today crosses many lands, communities, nations, and territories. So to begin, I'd like to invite people to place in the chat your name and the Indigenous peoples and nations on whose lands you are currently on today. And while we meet on this virtual platform, I want to acknowledge that land acknowledgements are important in recognizing the ancestral and continuing relationship that exists between Indigenous peoples and their traditional lands and territories. And they also help people reflect on how they place themselves in relation to Indigenous peoples while acknowledging their inherent rights to the land. And most importantly, land acknowledgements recognize the land as a living being. And in honoring the land, we are reaffirming our commitment to Mother Earth. So I would like to welcome everyone to this session on Indigenous cultural safety and humility and systemic racism, connecting the dots for deeper understanding to strengthen health providers and practice, which is presented by Harley Eagle. And funding for this initiative has been provided by Indigenous Services Canada, Ontario region. The session will be an hour and a half in length, and we will have a question and answer session at the end. You can use the raise your hand icon and take yourself off mute, and we'll also be moderating the chat and the Q&A function as well. So we encourage people to keep the camera off if possible and remind everyone to respect the stories of others that's being shared. And we're also going to be doing a short evaluation at the end. So now to begin, I would like to hand it over to Harley to begin its presentation. So miigwech, Harley.
Thank you so much, Holly, and thank you everyone for choosing to be here today and to listen to me. I am looking forward towards the end when we'll do some interaction as well. That's always my favorite part. Thank you also for the gift of tobacco and for the beautiful artist's gift that you gave me. It's a little bunny. I have it right here in front of me. Oops, the other way around. It's beautiful. Yeah, I'm looking forward to this session. And just as we get rolling here, I just wanted to let you know the way I thought about presenting today was, I do this work in so many different settings, mostly healthcare, but other settings as well. And I thought I would go through the process of cultural safety and cultural humility and kind of explain it as I go. So I'll kind of cruise through the process. I typically take a day, sometimes 2 days to work with organizations. So this will just be kind of an overview, but I'll share my slides and I try to use vibrancy. So hopefully it'll keep your interest. And then just think about reactions you might be having, comments. You can utilize the Q&A, but we will make sure at the end that we spend some time sorting through any questions or comments or reactions. I'll say some more in a few moments here, but yes, my name is Harley Eagle, and I am Dakota and Anishinaabe, originally from Treaty 6 and Treaty 4 territory. I'm from a place called Wapahaska, Dakota First Nation, just south of Saskatoon. Whitecap, it's known as. Some of you may have been there before. It's got a big casino and a conference center and a golf course. It's a fairly progressive but my aunt always reminds us, who's a traditional healer, that there's a price to progress, because where the golf course now is where she used to go to collect her medicines, and my cousins hunted there. Now they can't because there's this golf course. So there's always a price to Western's understandings of progress. And I'm calling in from the beautiful unceded territories of the Comox people on Vancouver Island, where I currently live. Excuse me. And there's four main clans of people here: Coast Salish and Kwakwaka'wakw. And it's the Satlut, the Satsitla, the Ayaksin, and Patlach people. But we're also learning, as we're in deep relationship with the Comox people, we're learning there's other groups too that have been kind of left out, and that's a whole part of the colonial process, is the erasure of who we are, especially with distinct identities and things like that. So we're learning more and more as we engage with the Comox people here. And the picture behind me is from the northern tip of Vancouver Island, a place called San Joe Bay. It's in the land of the Kwakwaka'wakw and Kwaguth people, and we lived there for 15 years. So it's a place that's really etched on our hearts and in our memories, and it's such a beautiful, beautiful place, and not very populated either. So you can go to beaches like this and not see anybody, and it's really quite amazing. So I'm going to share my slides with you now. It helps to keep me on track as well. So hopefully you can see them. And yeah, I'm going to trust. Just let me know if you can't see them. And here we go. So yeah, I want to just, like I said, present to you the way that I talk about cultural safety and engage with organizations and companies and individuals on understanding what Indigenous cultural safety and humility is, and how it's connected to this terrible notion of systemic racism. But we always feel that it's good to do this work in such a way that you have an analysis of what we're up against, so an analysis of systemic racism. And in more recent years, we've also been focusing more on Indigenous specific racism as well, because there's different dynamics of on these lands of how racism has impacted us as Indigenous people. So just a few more words about myself in keeping with Indigenous protocols. Not only am I Dakota and Anishinaabe, we're also connected to the Métis nations as well, both in terms of heritage. One of our great-grandmothers was a Métis woman. And then also politically too, Wapahaska Dakota First Nation was politically aligned with Métis people in that area of Saskatchewan, and we fought alongside the Métis people during the Battle of Batoche with Louis Riel and Gabriel Dumont and others. Several of my relatives were killed at that time as well. So we feel this deep sense of connection to the Métis Nation as well. And just as Holly mentioned too, like all the elders and knowledge keepers that have been present in our lives, maybe they're not with us anymore. I want to spend just a moment just reflecting, kind of, I call it the back view acknowledgement, like turning around and looking behind us to see all those people that have influenced us in our lives. And it's really especially important for me too, because I didn't grow up knowing about colonization and all of that, even though I lived the experience as being an Indigenous person. Both my parents are survivors of residential school, or they passed away now. My mother was in Indian hospitals, and they had so many different experiences, but they didn't really understand the dynamics either. They just lived it and lived with the impact of it, and passed that on to us as their children as well. And it wasn't until my early 20s, mid 20s, that I started to learn a lot more about this. And it's when my partner and I moved to Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, and worked among the Oglala Lakota people, who are part of the Dakota Nation, and we were working with activists and people working on social justice issues within the Pine Ridge Reservation, and also the impact of colonization, the ongoing impact. And that's where I started to learn. They really spent a lot of time, walking alongside me as I walked alongside them, and I got to learn in such a really powerful way what has happened to us as Indigenous people. So I want to just acknowledge all of those teachers that have influenced my life as well. And then, so they got us involved in, this was back in 1996 when we started working down there, and they got us involved in Indigenous rights advocacy, including local and national and international. We lived there for 7 years, but we continued the work when we moved back to Canada. And we took on leadership positions with the organization we were working with, and so that gave me this ability to connect internationally with Indigenous people. We did work with the United Nations and other global entities, and I got to travel to many places throughout the world. And I remember the first time that I went to India and I was visiting with Indigenous people from India. I didn't even know at that point that there were still Indigenous people in India. But as I sat there listening to them, I remember thinking to myself, if I closed my eyes, I could be in Australia, I could be in New Zealand, I could be in Canada, I could be in the US, anywhere where there's still First Nations people. The impacts of colonization result in pretty much the same existence in this modern world of living with all of those terrible experiences of colonization. So it gave me this global understanding of colonization, this, and I call it a global phenomena. So we bring that into our work to help us to understand the reach of colonization that has impacted the world over. So I'll explain a bit more of that in a few moments. They also got us involved in dismantling racism, and so I became a trainer in anti-racism. And eventually, I ran a program in the United States. I co-directed a program in the U.S. Focused on racism and other forms of oppression as well. We got involved in conflict resolution through something called restorative justice, and I'm guessing that many of you have heard of restorative justice. It's a holistic way of dealing with conflict, where the people who are involved in the conflict, through a very careful, facilitated process, are brought together and they sort through it and figure out what's going to make things, what's going to restore the relationships back to some form of balance. And so I became a trained mediator, and we used Indigenous processes like the circle process. And so I became a facilitator of circle process, which I continue to do to this day. That led to my Western education, and I have a master's degree in conflict analysis and management from Royal Roads University here on Vancouver Island. And I stay very connected to Royal Roads since I graduated. They kept me kind of connected in many different ways, including I was the scholar in residence for the Masters in Health and Health Leadership program a couple years ago. I've sat in leadership positions at the university, and I do a lot of work training professors and instructors around cultural safety and trauma-informed practice, which I also realized that I needed to know. I needed to understand the impact of trauma on my own life, things that I've experienced and lived through. I needed to understand my parents' experience of trauma, because for many years, especially as a young teenager and into my early 20s, I was quite angry at my parents for the way they raised me. And I didn't understand, why they raised us in kind of a harsh home and kind of a driven home. We used to tease my mother about hugging her, because we'd say it's like hugging a post. She'd want to hug us, and when we would go in for a hug, she would stiffen up. And to her dying day, that's the way she was. And I didn't understand those dynamics until I started to know about residential schools and boarding schools and realized they lived through that. That was their experience. So it wasn't their fault that they raised us that way. They didn't want to. They loved us. They just didn't know how to appropriately and within community and that sort of thing. So understanding trauma through trauma-informed practice was really helpful for me, and it helps me to stay on my own healing journey. So I'm trained in trauma-informed practice and healing, and also I have a certificate in integrative somatic therapy. And I'll explain somatics here in a few moments. I'm sure many of you know what somatics are, but it's a big part of our work nowadays. So I'll explain it in a moment. So all of those elements, dismantling racism, Indigenous rights advocacy, conflict resolution, and trauma-informed practice and healing, are all a part of cultural safety and humility. And so I became a facilitator at a health authority here on Vancouver Island in 2014. But previous to that, I kept hearing about this concept of cultural safety and humility, and I was attracted to it because it had all the elements events that I'd been working on for many years. And so that's why I decided to take a position with Island Health here on Vancouver Island. And our program as a health authority all across Vancouver Island was the first health authority in Canada to develop a program and hire people just to do cultural safety work exclusively, not off the side of a nurse's desk or a physician's desk or some other healthcare professional's desk, which was happening and it's happened all over Canada. Many people were doing this work, but alongside their other responsibilities. But we were hired specifically to conduct a program throughout the health authority. And so I did that for a number of years, and then I've always consulted on the side as well. But now, in the last 6 years, 7 years now, I've been consulting full time, and most of my work is in healthcare. I work with many health authorities, the provincial health authority, First Nations Health Authority, and many different organizations that support physicians and nurses, like the Doctors of BC, and colleges as well, like the regulators, like the College of Physicians and Surgeons, nurses and midwives. They're all my clients that I do a lot of work with them around cultural safety and humility. I get to be a part of so many exciting endeavors too. There's a program called Real-Time Virtual Support, where it's physicians and specialists in big settings like Vancouver and other, Kelowna and places like that, where rural physicians can call in, and it's virtual support, and for physicians who maybe haven't done procedures like they constantly do in urban settings, but suddenly they have to do some procedure that they might have only done in training. So they can call into this line, and virtually they can be guided through the process. But 70% of the calls come from First Nations based care providers. So they need to be culturally safe when they do their work. And so that's why I consult with them, and we work at cultural safety for them. And there's other programs, exciting programs that I'm a part of, where we're training rural healthcare providers, mostly physicians, on being culturally safe and trauma informed. I think we've trained over 600 rural healthcare providers already. So I get to be a part of all these wonderful projects as a consultant, and be in many different areas. Then the last thing I'll say about consulting is, this work needs to be everywhere, not just in the healthcare world. And so there's many of us that work as consultants in other realms as well. So I work with police agencies and other government agencies, Department of Fishery and Oceans, and many others that know they need to be engaging with Indigenous people in a respectful way. So cultural safety is really. And then there's also for-profit companies, which is really interesting, because they want to embrace the TRC 94 calls to action as companies, and they want to attract more Indigenous people to work with them. And they now realize that they need to be culturally safe companies when they do that. So some of the companies I work with, just so you know, are the Northwest Company, and some of you might be really aware of the Northern stores and stores like that. So they've been trying to embrace the calls to action, and we've trained over 600 of their new store managers to be culturally safe in when they're in community. And then Sony ImageWorks, they do movies like Into the Spider-Verse and things like that, those big blockbuster movies. They want to also attract more Indigenous artists to work with them, and they want to embrace the TRC calls to action. Then the last one I'll mention is Aritzia. Some of you may know of the clothing store Aritzia. They're also interested in this, and doing this kind of work and attracting more Indigenous people to be working with them as well. So enough about me. So yes, and it's acknowledgements, just as beautiful what Holly said about the importance of land acknowledgements. And so I want to also just say a few words about that. In form of protocols and customs that we do as Indigenous people at the beginning of our gatherings. Not only do we often provide acknowledgements, but then there's often a welcome from the local First Nations. If let's say we're at a big gathering right now in person, there'd be a welcome. And that welcome could include, words of wisdom from elders and knowledge keepers. There would have been probably some singing and some drumming and ceremony, prayer, all of those sorts of things, maybe some dancing. even, and we would have spent some time getting to know one another. All of those things we call protocols. So I got curious about the word protocol a number of years ago. And what I've learned about protocols when I researched it is that protocols is referencing an important document. And usually the first part of that document, like the table of contents, the introduction, the acknowledgement, that's the protocol to get you ready for the content. It can also mean it's also embedded in the process of making a book. So not the words, but the pages, the binding and the cover and all of that. And protocol, translated from Latin, means first glue. First glue. And so it's referencing that binding. And so that made perfect sense to me as an Indigenous person. When we do our customs and protocols, we're trying to activate the glue, the reminders of what it means to present ourselves in the best way possible as an individual, but then also as a collective or a community. What are those things that help to interact in a good way so that we can do the work in front of us. And so all of those activities that we do, help us to arrive into spaces ready for the work that we're going to do. Because some of the work that we have to do is uncomfortable. It's not easy. So preparing ourselves, our bodies, and our interactions is so important for this work. It's important to the work of cultural safety and humility as well. And I'll explain that in a few moments. And we also need that in this moment of who we are as human beings living on this planet Earth, that there's so many challenges that we're carrying right now. It seems like the efforts around truth and reconciliation in some ways seem to be reducing, but yet we still need to be on this journey. And then there's lots of things going on in our society right now in terms of wars and struggles and, the threat of tariffs and all of that is creating so much anxiety in our lives. We're noticing that in our work. And so we need protocols more than ever to help ourselves to be regulated and to be centered and grounded, and that's what protocols can help us do. And then I just want to also throw in there too, the challenges of our work. It's hard sometimes to give up 2 hours, or an hour and a half to come to sessions like this, or we work with organizations where they give up a day or 2 days, and you can see the stress in a lot of people because they have their regular work to take care of, right? And so there's so many reasons why we need centering and grounding in the form of protocols. And then we also talk about self-care, and it's a form of looking after ourselves to do those activities that help us to stay grounded and then with each other as well. At the same time, there's many calls to action within our society, whether it's the TRC 94 calls to action or missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls or the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, all kinds of ways that we can embrace. And that's helpful. That we can take some encouragement from that. And this is an act of truth and reconciliation, decolonizing and all of that in this moment as well. And our work is shaped off of, especially the TRC calls to action, the 94 calls to action. We try to bring those into the work that we're doing all the time. A way that I think about these kinds of presentations and learning and developing our cultural safety capacity is through a model called 70-20-10. And basically it's equals 100%. And this model is quite popular in the business world and the healthcare world as well. And maybe some of you have heard of this model. Basically, what it says that any new learning you're doing, whether it's a new piece of clinical equipment or a computer program or a big concept like cultural safety and humility or anti-racism or whatever it may be, at the formal level, so coursework, workshops, that's considered formal. Anything that takes you out of your regular workflow, at the 10% level, you should be spending time in that learning area, but only 10%. And the problem that we recognize in this fast-paced Western world is that we often put all of our eggs into the workshop basket. And we feel like if we send people off to a workshop, they should come back experts and teach everybody else. But that's not how we learn as human beings. We need to make it relevant in our lives, and we need repetition to practice, to make mistakes, to learn from it and try things out. So this model pays attention to that, and it says at the 70% level, the learning should be informal in your regular workflow. And that's where, organizations need to figure out how do we support and resource people for that ongoing learning in their regular workflow. And most organizations, well, I should say all organizations and companies that I work with struggle with that 70%, mainly because everybody's so busy and there's, budget constraints and things like that. So, but we've been doing this work long enough now where there are organizations that are figuring out what that 70% looks like for them, and we can learn from those attempts and what's working. And really, every organization needs to figure out and make it relevant for them. So there's no manual that says this is what you need to do. And then the final 20% is learning from others. So looking to the people that already are operating in culturally safe ways. They can be our mentors, our champions, our assessors. And learning from them by watching them and learning from them. And for me too, that 20% is learning from each other too, in terms of listening to each other's thoughts, our successes, our challenges. And so today we're firmly in the 10% with a little bit of the 20% because there's an opportunity for us to connect and learn from each other as well. So these are the things that we try to do in our workshops, and I'll touch on them in this presentation. We try to provide an Indigenous perspective on the history and current reality of colonizations and how it connects to racism. And and most of my workshops at the beginning, we try to show you where racism even started. And then that helps us to build an analysis of systemic racism. And so I'll show you that today, where this terrible concept of racism even came from. And it's deeply connected to the story of colonization. And when we know that, then we can start to see how it gets put into place systemically so that we can figure out what to do about it. If we know how it functions and we know its roots, then we can start to create change. And then we'll look at some skills that we find are helpful, things like addressing racism, so anti-racism, understanding trauma and being trauma-informed, understanding somatics, and I call it somatics-informed practice. So we'll touch on that. And then this work really works in solidarity with diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts as well. And then I'll start with defining some key principles of Indigenous cultural safety and humility. I'll define it in and of itself, and then I'll show you kind of the learning process. And hopefully that will be helpful for your own practice and maybe for your organization and how it can continue to build capacity. We use a lot of circles in our work. We're not going to do a circle here, but I just wanted to make sure that you know that circle process is very important. It allows us to connect in deep ways. And elders and knowledge keepers have told us over the years to never lose the circle. That became a challenge in the virtual setting when COVID hit, but we figured it out. And so this is an example of how we do our virtual circles. It's designed to mimic the talking circle process. And then there's always a few guidelines that we talk about in the circle process. When we're meeting face to face, we have a lot more complex guidelines that we go through. But for the virtual setting, these are some of the things we talk about. We'll only have a few short minutes with each other, so be mindful of sharing time. Speak from your own experiences and from your heart as well. Listen to each other as attentively as possible. I know in this virtual setting, some of us have developed some really pretty strong skills around multitasking, taking care of other things while we're listening in the virtual setting, but we ask people to maybe put those down so that we can listen to each other in our introductions in a respectful way. And then focus on the question at hand, and we post the questions on the screen, and then we put them in the chat so people can have a guide and a prompt. Because most people are scared of working or of speaking in public. It's one of the most feared things in our Western society is speaking in public. So we acknowledge that, and we do what we can to help people to be as regulated as possible. But nervousness is a part of it. It's a human response to be nervous, but we can do things that help to regulate that. I always recommend that people bring into the virtual setting activities that help them to stay centered and grounded. So we'll send out a letter and remind or ask people to bring knitting, crocheting, or beading, anything creative and tactile. I have stones around my desk that I'm holding a stone when I talk. It really helps me to stay focused because it's activating the nerve endings in your hands. It's a place where I can put my nervous energy. And in our in-person workshops, we bring all sorts of arts materials like coloring, and it's really quite popular in our workshops. So we bring coloring sheets and pencil crayons. We bring pipe cleaners, things that people can do with their hands. And one of the reasons why, or maybe the main reason why, is because we're going to be looking at uncomfortable material. And a lot of times that discomfort, if we don't know what to do with it, and if we don't have the capacity to deal with the discomfort, then we shut it down, we push it away, or we leave. So we're always trying to do things that help us to build our capacity to stay in the uncomfortable. And so going back to the introductions, this is an example of the questions that we ask in the circle. So of course, your name, a little bit more about yourself, just helping people to be more relational. And then the second question is really important. We started to bring in the notion of who are your people? What's your ancestry? So beyond nationality, we want people to consider, looking way back into who are they as in terms of their identity, their cultural identity. And sometimes people struggle with that question, and I acknowledge that, and I remind people that, maybe you don't know because maybe there's adoption in your history, or maybe it's just never been shared with you. But knowing that's really important. And we work with that concept throughout our session. So we introduce it here in the introductions, and then we'll ask profound questions like, why do you do the work that you do? And it's really quite amazing to see where that question takes people. And when you're sitting in a circle and you hear your colleagues that maybe you've worked with for years, but you don't really know them, but when they share from a question like that, it builds awareness and it builds connection. People get curious about one another, and they start to connect in deep ways. I always like when we're in person sessions, the break that we take right after the circle, like for tea or snacks or whatever. There's always lots of conversation because people continue their conversations in an informal way outside the circle. They're making those connections, and that's the power of the circle, is connecting, and especially in an authentic way, in a deeper way. I noticed that there's a hand raised. Is there something that I need to take care of? Maybe you can let me know, Holly or Jessica. With that, so this is something that we're doing a lot more of in our workshops in the last few years, is including some what we call somatic micro breaks. And even in this moment, you've been looking at the screen for a long time, for several moments. So we always recommend to people in virtual settings to look away from time to time. Look away from the screen, look around your room. And one of the reasons why somatically, and here's I'll explain somatics a little bit more, but it's about paying attention to the wisdom of your body and how our nervous system functions. And so sometimes staring intently, it mimics something for us, especially in our reptilian brain. Because if you look at creatures in the wild, when they're crouched somewhere staring, they're usually they're hunting, they're ready to pounce. And so their body tenses up and it gets ready to spring into action. Or maybe they're scared of something, and so they're watching really intently, and their body kind of goes into freeze mode, right? So that the staring into the camera or onto the screen can mimic that for us. And so we always recommend that people look away from the screen from time to time and just notice some mundane things in your room, in the space, because that'll help to bring your brain back into regulation, especially if you notice things like the color of paint on your walls, how many light bulbs are in the ceiling. Because mundane things, if you're looking at mundane things, your body feels like, oh, things must be fine because you're noticing mundane things. You're not staring intently looking for threat or danger. So that's why we bring in somatics, and I'll explain it a little bit more in a few moments. So The learning process for Indigenous cultural safety and humility, I will define it in a few moments, but I just want to explain to you the learning process. We start with learning about knowledge and understanding. If you look at the literature of cultural safety, it often talks about knowledge, so looking, building our knowledge, but we've added the word understanding because knowledge can be simply academic, but we want people to feel, what they're learning about in their bodies, to make connections, to have a really robust comprehension. I'm struggling to find the word. Yeah, comprehensive knowledge. That's it. Comprehensive knowledge, as well as sympathetic awareness. And when I hear that word sympathetic, I think about our sympathetic nervous system, which helps us to be social. It helps us to understand connection. And that's what we're trying to do in this portion is connect ourselves to this story of colonization as well. Because sometimes when we're working with our allies, sometimes they feel disconnected from the story. But we do our work in such a way that it brings people into the story. And so they find themselves in the midst of. And that's what understanding means, can mean in between or in the midst of. So that's why we've added understanding to that portion. And then the second stage is skills. So what kind of skills do I need to navigate this history and current reality of our colonial society? And then the third step is moving towards collaborative action and emergent action. And notice that it's the third step because we have to build our knowledge and understanding first, and we have to increase our skills, especially around connection. And then usually through that collaboration, when it's done authentically, that's where the action emerges because we can't think what the action is going to be before we do all this work of knowledge and understanding and skills. We have to allow for the action to emerge out of the connections that we're making. So we have a full understanding of what we're up against by hearing each other's voices through that collaboration. And that isn't easy work. So we add a fourth step to all of this, and it really becomes the first step. It's building that container through protocols and that sort of thing, through connections to help us to have more capacity to hear the uncomfortable, to embrace it, and to engage authentically. And we call it a safe enough container because it's difficult things we have to look at. So it's not going to feel all nice and pleasant all the time. We build our capacity to deal with the uncomfortable. And so this is the last bullet is just a summary. So container building, understanding and skills, and then action. So, and we do our work in this way. We start with a big picture. We systems thinking, 1,000-foot view, jetliner view. Some people call it the balcony view. I call it the side of the hill view. It's this metaphor for coming up to the side of the hill together so that we can look downriver to understand the impact of history and what occurred, even beyond the picture, where it's harder to see, but knowing that history has impact and shaped us as human beings so that we can understand our reality right in front of us. And then we can also start to look into the future a little bit from this vantage point as well. What's in store for us? What do we need to prepare ourselves for, moving forward? And eventually we do the work of locating ourselves. So eventually we get to that part of saying, so where are you in the forest? And from this vantage point, it helps you to understand your location in the forest as well. You might find that there's allies around you that you didn't know were there, or a path that's just near you that you could be taking that could be helpful. And then I have a medicine wheel here, and medicine wheel, I'm sure many of you know, have, engaged with this, or maybe it's part of your culture. It's a part of my culture in terms of both my Anishinaabe and Dakota background. And so it's here because we are shaped by Indigenous ways of knowing and being. It shapes the way that we do our work. We're guided by it, so it's up in the sky. But notice that it's translucent. And the reason why I wrote it in here or put it in here as translucent because when I live here, I'm living here on the West Coast where the medicine wheel isn't a part of the cultures here, the Indigenous cultures. So I have to make sure that I'm culturally safe when I do my work and look to the genius and brilliance and the wisdom of what's here in these territories and bring in folks that can speak to the metaphors, the symbols, the teachings of the land here. So that's why it's translucent, so that I remember to do my work in a culturally safe way. And then the metaphor of the side of the hill. And we all have backpacks. We all have skills already. And it's important to share those skills with one another. But there's always room for more skills too in our backpacks. This is a picture of Mount Kilimanjaro in Tanzania. And the reason why we put this here is we often work with folks from other parts of the world. And what we've noticed over the years is as we start talking about colonization, from other parts of the world will start to share their experiences from their perspectives of what's happened to them in other parts of the world. And so going back to that notion of the global phenomena of colonization, we can learn from one another. And we can also see solidarity in one another when we know that we're connected to this overall experience of colonization. So we always encourage people from other parts of the world to share their stories, make those connections, and it'll help you as that individual, and it'll help others to make those connections to our shared experiences. And this picture is really a metaphor for cultural safety work. So it's the same vantage point, side of the hill, but now instead of the river and water, you have a man-made road. And that's the work of cultural safety, is to examine colonial structures and patterns. That's primary what we do based on our cultural teachings and influences to help build that container, and to see other ways of doing things. But we examine what are we up against in terms of colonial structures and institutions, and then what can we utilize within those structures to take us to a different place, and what needs to change, what is still causing violence and harm, and how do we start to change those elements together. So the work is focused on colonial structures and systems. So here's a definition of cultural safety and humility using the pictures as well. So cultural safety is defined as an environment where power imbalances, so the colonial structures utilize power imbalances, to figure out how we address them, so that no matter who you are, you receive safe and appropriate care or services. That's an aspirational place. That's where we want to get to, but I don't know of any structures that have achieved that as of today. So that begs the question, how will we get there? Because many people know it's going to take us generations to get to a different structures on our land that are in keeping with equity and all of those wonderful things. So then it begs the question, how do we get there? And cultural humility is that process. So it's a values-based process. It's called cultural humility, but you start to add other values in as well, like integrity and courage and generosity and fortitude and empathy and all of those wonderful things too. A value-based process of self-reflection, so looking inward first, and that's why somatics is so important, because it helps you to understand yourself in all of this, and then you can understand how you've been shaped by the colonial systems around us, and that gives us direction on what we can do about this. I do want to just very quickly give acknowledgement to where this concept started in with Maori people in New Zealand, and it was primarily women, Maori nurses in the healthcare profession, that started this concept of cultural safety and humility. That's really important for me as an Indigenous man, to make sure anytime I talk about this, that I let people know where this came from, and to raise my hands to the brilliance and genius of and resiliency of these amazing Indigenous women. And Ira Hapita Ramsden was one of the first ones to write about it and to construct a framework around cultural safety and humility. And then also here in BC and other parts of Turtle Island as well, many people have been talking about this, Indigenous people, and standing firm, saying this needs to happen. So I like to raise my hands to them, and First Nations Health Authority here in British Columbia has been doing this work for 13 years now in a really profound way. But why do we focus on Indigenous cultural safety? Because cultural safety should be for everybody, no matter who you walk in this world, you should be treated in culturally safe ways. Absolutely. But we focus on Indigenous cultural safety to reflect our lived and living experiences. So if you look at the data, you'll see that Indigenous people are always at the top of the list in terms of disparities throughout our society. No matter what you're looking at or sector you're looking at, you'll see that we're at the top of the list. So we want to influence that and change that. But we also want to, in terms of our lived and living experiences, we also want to include our knowledge, our Indigenous ways of knowing and being as well, our knowledge, our wisdom, our practices. That we want to reflect that in the way we do our work as well. And I love this quote from Dr. Nadine Caron, the first Indigenous woman heart specialist surgeon in Canada. And she said this: "We need our stories that can't be forgotten and the data that can't be ignored." Data is very important to this work. It gives us a direction on what we need to be working on. And then the role of vulnerability and authenticity, that's what I mean. I don't mean vulnerability in terms of exposing ourselves to danger, but being authentic, being able to share our truth and our reality. We have to have those spaces. And it's very important to this work. So there's a story from Brené Brown. I won't go into the background of Brené Brown. I'm going to assume that many of you know who she is. She works on shame. Like her research as a social worker has been on shame, and then she helps people to look inward to work through the shame that she says is very prevalent throughout our society. And she told a story a number of years ago about how, racism is the biggest issue facing the United States. And we add to that and say the globe over, is dealing with classism, racism, sexism, so all these isms. And she says, but we're not creating spaces where we can actually do something about it because we try to, but something always stops us. And she says it's shame, because she says if we want to talk about these isms, that eventually we'll have to talk about things like privilege and the discomfort that comes up around that, both for folks that maybe are racialized as white or men, and the defensiveness comes up, and it's also uncomfortable to talk about it. So we end up shutting it down and pushing it away. But the root of all of that is shame and our lack of ability to know what to do about it. And she says that shame is held in place by three things: secrets. So just think about residential schools and how so many people didn't know about them here in Canada until more recently. You go to other places in the world, like the US, where a lot of people don't know about boarding schools and residential schools. So, and the power of exposing a secret as well shows up in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Silence, there's many different processes of silencing the voices of Indigenous people, and also our own silence. A lot of times we don't know what to do when we see injustice. We only have a few ways of dealing with it, and sometimes they're not helpful. And then sometimes we just keep quiet. We don't know what to say or how to say something. A judgment. This is based on the common narratives that are based in stereotypes and myths and misconceptions of Indigenous people, but it shapes the way that people work with us because they prejudge us based on those narratives. And so she goes on to say the cool thing, that vulnerability is the antidote to shame. It's also the gateway to creativity and innovation. And I've added to this too, because this is something that I've noticed in our work. It's also a space for what I call twofold remembering. And so the first fold of remembering is remembering our bodies, because we often exist only in our heads almost, and we don't know how to read the signs that our body is telling us. So it's like remembering, reconnecting ourselves somatically to our intuition, to when our body is feeling tension or things going on, taking that as direction, taking that as wisdom. It's telling us something. So it's reconnecting our bodies, and then also remembering our ancient practices that have been so helpful, tried and true for thousands of years. It's bringing that back into remembrance, the teachings of our ancestors. So that's the other space that this provides us. And then it's so we always provide space for hearing reflections and questions throughout my workshops. I'll stop and ask, and it usually takes people a while, but towards the end of our sessions, there's always this really powerful conversation going on. And I invite people to offer half-baked ideas, because sometimes we want to be perfect, and we don't want to be politically incorrect or harmful. So we don't say anything then, but I welcome people to try on half-baked ideas, stumble through what you're trying to ask, and my response might be stumbling back, but maybe together we'll bake something delicious together. And so I talked earlier too about the glue that holds us together, and I usually have a story that I share with you of how I came to learn this, and it was really based in humility and something that I caused when I was meeting with some elders, and the elders were basically they were helping me to translate the circle guidelines into Lakota language, but they couldn't decide on exact words because for those of you that are Indigenous speakers, language speakers, you know that there's nuances community to community, even in the same language group that shifts from community to community, sometimes to family. There's little differences. So that's why they couldn't agree. But what they all did agree upon was the stories that they shared from when they were young people, and they would go to community meetings, and their elders and knowledge keepers would talk about values and say it's important to remember that we're all connected and no one is greater or less than, and we have to pay attention to the voices of the world around us, not just human voices, to take the time to learn from one another. And the circle process really helps with that. Even when there's disagreement, you get to learn from other perspectives, to walk with honor, to bring those principles and those ethics that we many of us are nurtured with, bring those into the way that we interact with each other, how we hold ourselves, how we hold each other, how we treat each other's stories as well, especially in the circle process. We remind people to hold each other's stories with integrity because your stories belong to you, and we don't share your stories outside the circle. We share what we're learning, especially about ourselves, but not the details of each other's stories. To walk with kindness, through generosity, to act from our hearts, courage. The root of the word courage in French, coeur, is heart. So courage is less an act of bravery and valor and more of something that comes from within in you. Empathy is understanding and caring, and the word understanding there. Empathy is about when we connect with our bodies, when we feel, when somebody is struggling and they're telling us their story, we feel it within ourselves. And usually because difficult and sadness and grief is familiar to all of us. We know what it feels like because of our own experiences. So empathy is connecting at that level to feel what another person is feeling, not sharing the story, but the feeling of it. And then that helps you then to provide care for a person that's struggling. Fortitude, I really like this word. If you break it down in Latin, it means strength of mind, which helps us then to think about critical thinking. How are we going to put our minds together to figure out a way forward? The circle process is really helpful for that because critical thinking is best done together, not by ourselves. But it can also mean healing. Because if we want to think from the strong places of our minds, if you will, from our prefrontal cortex, we have to have a level of being able to process trauma. Because if we're living with unprocessed trauma, then it keeps us in fight or flight often, right? It keeps us in the dorsal nervous system and other parts of our nervous system, but not in the sympathetic nervous system. And that's where our best critical thinking is done, when we can get up to the sympathetic nervous system. So I think fortitude is also speaking about healing. How do we tend to ourselves and each other so that we can process that which we've gone through and lived with and continue to live with, so that we can get up into the upper parts of our brain to think critically. And so this is how the knowledge and understanding portion looks to us. We often share videos, things like, we use this little video called 500 Years of History in 2 minutes from the Eighth Fire web series. We use a lot of video in our work so that you hear other voices. I'm not going to share this video with you now, just an example of how we do our work. And then we connect anti-racism and somatics and decolonizing together. We connect the dots there, because we want to start understanding the impact of colonization and racism on our bodies. And the folks that have been doing this work for a few years now, they talk about how we've been trying to address the isms based on mostly academics, like trying to explain things away, or from a place of morality. That's right, this is wrong, let's not do the wrong thing. And that's good. But one place that we haven't looked at is how our bodies have been impacted for generations, and how we've been conditioned to show up in certain ways or to shut certain things down. So we're starting to bring it back into our teachings so that we can build our capacity to deal with the things that we live with, and also get to a place of critical thinking together so that we can figure out a way forward. And so we have all kinds of exercises that we do in our workshops and bring in examples, and we also look to others in the group to share their examples of how they work at regulation. And being self-regulated isn't just about calmness, it's also about being aware, sensing what's going on in your body and knowing how to respond. So this is just, I'm not going to work through this example, but it's just one of the examples that we use that Dr. Ral Gupta introduced to me. And we need that. The reason why I put that there is that in our workshops, we'll go through some exercises to help to build our capacity, because we have to start looking at deeply at the history and current reality of colonization. And that's not easy, because there's lots of ugly things that we have to look at. So we work at it from four main themes. The first one is we start from a place of strength, to remember for time immemorial the richness of the worldview of Indigenous nations. And for here, I'll often read through a list of books written by Indigenous people that are amazing. Or I'll talk about techniques that we've had, like restorative justice, that came from Indigenous people all over the world, looking after the earth, all this wisdom that we've ignored for so long. I'll speak about those, start as a place of strength, because the next two themes that we have to do with the coming of colonization to the Western Hemisphere. So first of all, in forms of epidemics, the wave after wave of epidemics that reduced our population here on Turtle Island by up to 90%. So as the lower estimates of numbers of population before colonization are around 100 million, and the higher numbers are 190 million people lived on these lands, and we were reduced by 90%. We don't spend enough time thinking about that or feeling the impact of that, but certainly Indigenous communities are still living with that legacy. And then the third theme is all the policies and legislations that have, inflicted so much harm on Indigenous people and still continue to, like the Indian Act, or the legacy of residential schools, or the reserve system, or the Hamlet system, or Métis settlements. So, and you can get a doctorate on just one of these items here. So there's a lot to this, a lifelong journey of learning, but we have to understand those dynamics of how they've impacted and continue to impact, or have a legacy of unprocessed trauma in our lives. And there's so many things that we don't know about. And because I work with groups from the far north quite often, dog slaughters is something that many folks in the South don't know about, that have happened to Inuit and First Nations cultures that had dog teams for thousands of years, and how there was a policy in the 40s and the 50s that killed all their beautiful sled dogs, right? So many people don't know about it. And it wasn't until December, this past December, that the Canadian government finally apologized to Inuit people for being a part of that policy of dog slaughters. And then we come back to a source of strength. We talk about our resistance, that we've been pushing back against colonization ever since it started to happen to us. So I want people to know that, when you see Indigenous people protesting to this day, just to know that that's nothing new. We've been pushing back. We've tried to find ways, and the government would push back against us in our ways. So it's back and forth. It's caused a lot of harm to us, but it also has encouraged resiliency. And many of us are on our healing journey, and many of us are looking back to our intergenerational strengths, not just our intergenerational trauma, but also the legacy of the strengths of our people as well. Usually at this point, people are angry in our workshops at the Indian Act. So we spend some time sorting through what the Indian Act is and why it's still in place. I'm not going to do that work here today. And again, at this point, people are often feeling it in their bodies. So we take some time to tend to our bodies at this point. And then we'll ask people, what's going on for you in this moment? Because the body remembers this. And when we talk about it, the sensations can come back into our body. So we want to pay attention to what our bodies might be telling us in forms of its memory of these things. And then we move into skills. We talk about understanding trauma. We look to Dr. Judith Lewis Herman and her seminal book called Trauma and Recovery to help us to understand what psychological trauma is. We look to people like Gabor Mate and Dr. Peter Levine and others that help us to understand what trauma is, psychological trauma. We also bring in the words of our Indigenous healers and elders that have also informed us and worked with us on what we can do about around understanding the impact, and also what we can do about addressing those patterns of unprocessed trauma in our lives. We bring in the notion of trauma-informed practice as a way of thinking about a shift in our worldview, to understand that trauma is very prevalent throughout our society, not just for us as Indigenous people, but everyone in society is dealing with the levels of unprocessed trauma, which then helps us to create our organizations and our companies that reflect safety, trustworthiness, choice, collaboration, all of those wonderful things. And then we like to use this, I call this the motto of trauma-informed practice. Rather, if somebody is in your face because they're activated, we try to get to a place of remembering that it's not that something's wrong with that person, it's that things have happened to them that are unprocessed, that have brought them to this place. So it's kind of like looking behind a person to know that something has happened to them. And we always try to bring in a decolonized understanding of trauma-informed practice, because it's not just about our individual experiences. There's still things happening in society that continue to inflict harm on Indigenous people. So we use the term lived and living experiences. So lived kind of alludes to it's in the past, but we add the word living to know that we're waiting in colonization all the time. The patterns are continue to be there, and listening to our young people, they'll often inform us of how they're experiencing colonization in their young lives. So taking the time again to taking the time to notice what's going on in your body as well. So I'm just going to share really quickly here how we work at expanding our narratives to try to change those common narratives that that are out there around Indigenous people. So we do that by peeling back some layers. So we move away from narrow narratives and single stories to more complete understandings. We want to move away from only focusing on trauma. It's important to stay focused on that, but we also want to include our strengths and our resiliency and our resistance. And then exploring the causes. So the work of cultural safety is looking at those power imbalances found in colonial structures and institutions and patterns. And then we even started to think about, so where should we start the story of colonization? And the reason why we did this is in my own experiences of learning about this history of colonization, starting 500 years ago, when I was a young man, hearing about it, it actually left me angry, and rightly so, because we should be angry about what's happened here. But it also got me bitter, because that's all I heard was all this negative things that have happened over the last 500 years. And if you're non-Indigenous, and if you're of European background, and if you're white, then it's going to leave you at a very shamed place. And again, rightfully so, but getting stuck there isn't helpful. So what then we did was we introduced this notion of the older story of colonization. So we applied that motto of trauma-informed practice. So rather than saying what was wrong with European people when they came to our shores, something must have been wrong with them, we shifted that to say, what happened to them? What happened to European people to bring them to our shores in the way that they did? And so we jumped back 1,000 years ago and we looked at the history of Europe. And what we noticed that the indigenous people of Europe, especially in the eastern part of Europe at that time, were being colonized by the Holy Roman Empire. And I also want to say at this point, we could look at other parts of the world in other time eras and see very similar patterns of that happening as well. Colonization was already flourishing in many parts of the world and had been for thousands of years already. And that's impacted our world as we know it as well. And but 1,000 years ago, we noticed that for 400 years, that part of Europe was living under colonization. You start to see new countries coming forward out of that. Some of them that we know today came out of this era, but they didn't reform themselves in the form of indigenous ways of knowing and being. They formed themselves in the image of the colonizer structures, including Catholicism and, classism, patriarchy, sexism, ageism, disconnect from the land, seeing land as an object. All of those sorts of things happened during that time. So then the explorers go out, and because they're looking for new sources of trade and new resources to support that colonial lifestyle. So that's what happened. The once colonized became the colonizer. And one of the books said it this way that we look to: Europe, the initiator of one of the world's major processes of conquest, colonization, and cultural transformation, was also the product one. The colonized became the colonizer. So I'm going to take a deep breath there now too, because some of this stuff can be. We've found over the years that this is where people have a strong reaction, like, "Oh my goodness, this is much bigger than I thought I was." And for those that are non-Indigenous, they find their connection here to their own stories. If you talk with Irish people and Scottish people, they can tell you of how their people were colonized, but then they came to Europe, or came to this part of the world, came to Canada, or what's known as Canada now, and became white, and a lot of times they were fleeing their own colonialism, or to the colonial things that were happening to them as well. So a person that writes about this in a really profound way is Resmaa Menakem. I highly recommend his book, My Grandmother's Hands. He also does a lot of work online, helping people to process trauma, to somatically deal with the things that we might be carrying. And this is a quote from his book: "Trauma decontextualized in a person, unexamined and unattended to across time, can look like personality. We just blame it on that individual. It's just their personality. Or a family, we just blame it on their family traits, but we don't connect it to that history of unprocessed trauma. And then also in a people, it can look like culture. And that's our point around our Western culture, that its inception came out of their own colonization, but yet we've accepted it as kind of normal and the standard of how we live in this world." Yeah, so I'll just keep on going here. I'm just reflecting on the time, just maybe about 5 more minutes, and then we'll open it up um, for some conversation. So the last part of this is about recognizing that we want to move away from thinking it's just who we are as human beings. We want to start showing how this becomes systemic, how this gets embedded. And the first thing that we talk about is the doctrine of discovery. And so many people don't know about the doctrine of discovery, I'm finding, but yet it's the basis. And the TRC calls it out 3 different times. And it's the concept that was used to justify European sovereignty over Indigenous peoples and lands. It's such one of those big secrets, the foundation to colonization, but we don't know about it. We don't talk about it. And terra nullius is often connected with the doctrine of discovery. Terra nullius in Latin means empty land. So they were trying to say that there weren't almost 200 million people living on these lands. The land was empty. But how do you do that when you're encountering human beings all the time? Well, one of the first papal bulls, because that's what the Doctrine of Discovery is, it's a series of papal bulls. So these were edicts from the Catholic Pope from the 14th and 15th century that have become the moral and legal apparatus that has shaped colonization as we know it today. So morally, where that fit in was one of the first papal bulls was dealing with the problem that Christopher Columbus had, found the resources that he was looking for. He was lost, right? Because he was looking for India in his sailing routes. He found us, Indigenous people, instead. That's why we're called Indians. But he also found the resources and the land that they were looking for to support their lifestyle. But he had that problem of encountering all these beautiful, wonderful Indigenous people. So he kidnaps some of them. He goes back to Europe and he says, we got a problem. So one of the first papal bulls said something like this: if you encounter human beings on these, so-called new territories, if they're not Christians and you don't recognize their form of governance, then they're not fully human. So that's the moral part of it. They released, or they disconnected us from our humanity, and then it allowed for them to do terrible things to us without the guilt that goes along with treating human beings in such an inhumane way. And then it becomes legal over a number of centuries, 2 centuries, when all of those papal bulls were connected to say that international law, and that's what international law, it's basically precedents. So the court system, the US court system in the early 1800s collected these papal bulls and said, for 200 years, we've been living under these rules of the doctrine of discovery. Therefore, we have the legal right to say that we have sovereignty over these lands. So that's how it fits in. So the last layer that I want to peel off for us is, where does racism fit into all of this? So the doctrine of discovery is this notion of who was fully human was not applied to indigenous people when they were needed as allies to fight alongside European nations. So that's where treaties come in and collaborations between former European or European countries so that we would fight alongside them in their quest to make this land theirs. But when that goes away, you still need you need a rationale that can allow you to dehumanize so that you can have power over the indigenous people and you can subjugate them. So they turned to this guy, Carl Linnaeus, who is the father of modern day taxonomy. And they said, we want you to classify human beings because he has his classification system of plants and animals. So they said, we want you to classify humans, which if you read his diary, he doesn't want to do it because he said he already did. We're the human race, period. But because they figured that they would find this hierarchy to the human races, so-called human races, that would show that the group at the top, Caucasian at the top, would have more intelligence, morality, work ethic, all of those sorts of things. So that's what they theorized, and they wrote about it. And the further down the list you went on the hierarchy, the more derogatory the characteristics were. And at the same time, in that time, the 17th century, there was also the rise in this ideology called European exceptionalism. So they were already saying we must be the most brilliant, or there must be something different about us as European people, because look at what we've done. We've colonized the world. Look at our military. Look at our governance system. They were, pretty happy with themselves. So they were already saying and theorizing and ideologizing that they were the master race, if you will. So they were trying to prove it scientifically. They never could. All their attempts, they never could. So what we say about this is that race is a myth, but racism is real. That notion of that there's only one way to live our lives on this earth. And so that helps us to define what systemic racism is. It's more than just those ugly interactions between individuals. It also includes all the legislations, the complex social and political mechanisms that give shape to our societies that have been in place for hundreds of years. And then when we're conditioned in that system, when we grow up in that system, it conditions us to live in that world with those rhythms when they're such terrible rhythms. And so we often use an iceberg metaphor as a way of figuring out what we're going to do about it. And so if we use this as a metaphor, it helps us to realize that we have to get our faces into the water and change legislations and what we consider normal in our society. And we also have to look at ourselves and start to undo those patterns through somatics, through healing that changes the conditioning on our bodies. So this is the last slide that I'll share with you. So this is the foundation to our work that comes from an Indigenous group, activist group in Australia. It's attributed to Lila Watson. But she said, if you've come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. This isn't about helping Indigenous people. This is about realizing that we're all caught up in these colonial patterns and we've all been conditioned in that colonial way. And so we have to work at healing from that so that we can work together to figure out what to do about what we're experiencing in this world. So that's where I'll leave it. And I will stop sharing my screen now and would love to hear your thoughts, your comments, your reactions, your questions.
Me, Gwetch, for that, Harley. That was amazing. I've heard you speak before, which is why I reached out to you to do this session. And I just want to say before, if anybody else has things that they want to share, there's two things that were highly impactful to me in my learning. And one was how you used the metaphor of that winding road.
Hmm.
And you had talked about how it's the colonial structures and the systems as defined by this winding road of pavement and concrete. And I think the other thing that was really impactful that I guess I never thought of, but maybe was pretty obvious, maybe, was the fact that the doctrine of discovery was not applied when they needed us as allies.
Hmm.
And I think that's really interesting because it's interesting how we can pick which way or which direction we're going to go with that doctrine of discovery. And I think that's probably the doctrine of discovery, in my opinion, is one of the primary things that most people who live in this country that we now call Canada don't know about.
Yeah.
So residential school, people have learned about that because of the Truth and Reconciliation and things that are moving. but I don't think they inherently know about the doctrine of discovery and how it's still in place and how it still governs our laws.
Yeah. Yeah, the TRC calls it out and says, the Canadian government and all those government entities, municipal, provincial, federal, they should be repudiating, and repudiate means to make a statement or to stand against. None have. But who has are all the churches, all the Christian churches, and now we can say the Catholics too, because for decades they refused until 2023 the Pope made a statement of repudiation on the doctrine of discovery. So we can work with that, though. That's a step in this. And then how do we start to get the governments to recognize that this is something? But they're so scared, right? Because it's precedence, and they don't want to mess with precedence because what that might mean to the lack to their to that power and balance that they hold, right? So you can kind of see the core of cultural safety happening there, where they don't want to give up that power. But that's the work of cultural safety, is to address it. And I always like to say this too, like when I talk about things like the Indian Act and this, like we can't do this work alone. We need allies. We need allies that are going to hold their government to account. And we only represent not even 10% of the population in Canada. So we need allies that know this, that get this, that are bothered by this, that are angry about this, and so then they can collaboratively do something about it. Yeah.
So while people are thinking about and formulating some of their questions, I have a question. And I have a question when you were talking about cultural safety, in terms of what does that look like? Is it a process? Is it an outcome? Will we ever achieve it? What does that look like, or what do you think it looks like for you?
I think at this point, where I see it achieving is in individual interactions, because we work with folks that have lived experience of the toxic drug crisis and trade and sex trade, and they talk about that what changed their life was a culturally safe interaction with a healthcare provider or a social worker that saw them as human, treated them as human, and asked them, what can we do together to deal with what you're living with, and getting to the place of not saying, why are you an addict, but what happened? What's the pain? Where's the pain? And let's work at that. So I see those as successes in terms of cultural safety in those individual interactions. Where we're not seeing it happening is in the patterns of our structures and institutions. That isn't in place yet. But my hope is that if more and more people start to interact in culturally safe ways, and it benefits the healthcare provider as well. We hear those stories of people say, it transformed me. I love my job now. I hate the system and what it keeps trying to do to me, but those beautiful interactions that I get to have now based on working from a place of cultural safety and humility really changes people's lives and their practice. So I think if we keep on doing that, then it'll help to build some of those people will go into positions of leadership, and then they can start to figure out, so how are we going to make this, be a part of the pattern that our organization or that our system works under.
Miigwech for that, Harley. So we have a couple of questions. So I'm going to go to the Q&A first. So what suggestions do you have for organizations that are focusing most of their energy and resources on formal learning to shift towards a 70-20-10 learning model?
You know, in my work with Sony, what happened there was, because I did these workshops like this. We had half a days. Sometimes we do 4 2-hour sessions, over a month, with many different ways of doing it. But what they gravitated towards was the circle process. And they said, because they had the opportunity for once to share authentically and not to have the power structure, with the few voices at top telling people what to do, and everybody else having to, suffer with their frustration inside. But they had this space. So they said, can we work at that? Can we start to establish a circle process for our meetings? So my point there is to feel, if you go through the formal learning, feel where you feel like what's the most important for your organization. A lot of times it is that opportunity to connect authentically, because then that builds your skill for hearing each other and speaking from authenticity, and it also builds your skill in collaboration. And it also changes the pattern of systemic or power imbalance, when everybody's voice is being heard, and then you kind of do things based on everybody's voice being heard. So my point is to start to enliven or put life to those things that we talk about in the formal setting, but make them real in your life, and then also somatically start practicing, noticing what's going on in your body. Look to the work of Dr. Michael Yellowbird. I absolutely love his work, and we're starting to do some work together now. That neuro decolonization. So basically, that means understand that we've been impacted in our nervous systems by colonialism, and then also understand how your nervous system works, and then the decolonizing part of that, because that's the neuro part. The decolonizing part of that is to start to apply other ways of existing in this world, like yoga or meditation or cold water bathing or forest bathing or a ceremony. All of those things help to weaken the power of colonization. And it's no wonder that our ceremonies were banned, that they did terrible things to our children to disconnect us from our cultural practices, which are so powerful for keeping us as a human being, nurturing us as a human being who knows what love is and knows how to love. Right. So bringing those practices back are so, so important in this journey.
We're going to go to Shelby. So we're going to unmute Shelby. And in the meantime, I just want to read a note that's in the chat from Rebecca. And she says, on the individual change note, somatics are so important, and the transformation out of Catholic dominance will continue to be supported through somatics. And that humility, interconnection with all the creation, living, non-living, seen and unseen. And I greatly appreciate the progress on the somatic realm. So Shelby, if you want to take yourself off mute, Shelby, you can ask your question. And maybe, Jess, if we can hand it over to Steph. Go ahead, Stephanie.
Sorry, Holly, I didn't raise my hand. If I did, it was a mistake.
Oh, okay. Is there anyone else, Jess?
We had Rebecca with her hand up, so I will find her to see if she's available.
Okay.
Hi, thank you. I guess as I typed it in the chat, I guess it wasn't a question, just great thanks towards your work and support of that somatic realm. And it just is that humanness that we all need to really get down to and keep acting in that solidarity, like that wonderful quote by the lady Lila Watson there, like we're in this together. And in the realm of healthcare, like little huddles, that's a cultural practice we do in Southern Health here. We try to huddle, but it's usually after an incident, right? Like let's huddle before. Like, how do we huddle or share circles in anticipation of who is on our workload today? Like, kind of like you're saying, these protocols that can prepare us to be human in our work and recognize all of this history and our involvement and identities in that, and then just get down to the interconnection. Thank you. This has just been wonderful.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Yeah, I like to say, our best tool, the thing that we have that we can, best apply to all of this is our own nervous system. Right. So if we're doing that work to understand ourselves, that there's in mindfulness, there's 4 pillars. They call them 4 pillars of mindfulness. And the first one they call meta awareness. It's understanding your nervous system and how it operates. And then the next one is connection. So connection, the kind of reconnecting to your body, and also connections to people that can support you on your journey. And then the next one is insight into your own stories, your own traumas, to understand that that's why, like for me, it was my understanding that my parents experienced with residential school and my mother with Indian hospitals. Like I had a fear of the medical system that I didn't understand. You know, for many of us as Indigenous people, we have that fear, but I didn't get it until my mother talked about her experiences, especially in Indian hospitals, that I understood, okay, so I'm carrying that intergenerational impact and legacy of her fear in my own system. So I can realize that it's not necessarily mine to own, but it's impacted me. So I can see those patterns now, and I can do things that help me to ground myself and to be regulated. Because if we can do this work from a level of regulation, then we co-regulate with others. So those huddles become really important places, like you said, before crisis. But how can we be together in a way that we can feel each other's regulation, if you will, and co-regulate? Because that helps to build your capacity for when you have the crisis, and then you come together in a huddle. You already have the muscle memory of you, if you will, of just taking some deep breaths. You know, if somebody's more regulated than the other, then that helps to regulate others. Or you can just visibly just take a nice deep breath. If you're leading the huddle, you don't even have to say anything. But if you work at your own regulation, it'll spread, and then you can think from a more critical place in your brain when you're activated in a more regulated way.
Miigwech for that, Harley. We have one more question that we're going to ask before we end today. From previous employment, we've had to complete a cultural safety training upon onboarding. However, they did not require ongoing yearly recertification or training in a healthcare setting with a focus on working with Indigenous people. So how can we incorporate more meaningful training rather than a checkbox training that presents more performative and not applied to the work in healthcare?
Yeah. So that's a good example of that 70% that most organizations are struggling with, because we're so used to that workshop mentality and putting all our eggs there, and that's the only place we put it. So what we're seeing now is some organizations like Provincial Health Services Authority, where they're doing things like caucusing, you know, providing space, and I lead some of those caucus spaces for Indigenous health. That's at the leadership level now. So Indigenous leaders will meet once a month and just talk about what's going on for them. What's the impact of the things that are happening in the environment on your lives, and just a space where people can be with one another and voice what's going on, support each other in those sessions. So that's one way. I think there's many ways. You know, you can start to kind of bring in informal things too, because there's lots of things going on in our societies and in our communities that we can attend together. And so yeah, I think we need to start putting our resources and our support. And the last thing I'll say, you know, if you look into the 70-20-10 model, you'll come up with a video that explains it. And in that little video, one of the originators of this process says, you know, most managers will say, how do I manage people's ongoing learning? And he says that's the wrong question to answer. It's how do you resource and support them? So you're not managing what they're learning, but you provide some resources and you provide some support. You provide people sometimes you have to, as leaders, you have to say, we want you to go to this event. We want you to have this space, and here's some resources that will support you in it. Not always easy when we don't have the cash or the time, but most organizations are trying to figure that out. But it does take a couple of years to get to that, to realize you need that ongoing support.
So I would like to say miigwech, Harley, for joining us today. So on behalf of myself and the entire team here at the Center for Education and Research on Aging and Health, I want to say miigwech for sharing your knowledge, wisdom, and teachings with us. As people leave, they're going to be invited to complete the evaluation, which is always very helpful and provides great feedback to our speakers. We have a number of future events that we're going to be hosting here at CERAH, which will all be in our monthly e-newsletter, as well as our CERAH Facebook page and on our CERAH website. And on June 18th, from 12 to 1, our next CERAH webinar is going to be on elder abuse and the law, updates and perspectives on Canadian law, policies, and response. So with that, I would like to say miigwech, and I would like to say bamapi to everyone, and I hope everyone has a great rest of your day. And again, thank you again, Harley, for joining us and for participating in our speaker series here at CERAH. Bamapi, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.